campaign. Thank you. And so just as we begin, we do want to give a few housekeeping rules. If we could go to the next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping rules. As you might have just heard, this webinar will be recorded. So just a reminder to please keep yourself muted. And if you're not comfortable with your camera being shown in the recording, please keep it off. Another part is to please place your questions throughout the webinar in the chat. Folks will be there gathering them for our question and answer portion at the end. Another just reminder is to be respectful in the chat when it comes to the questions and through everything that we're doing today. So we're here as a learning space and to see what our steps are to end military exercises across the globe and what that will look like. So please just please put your questions in the chat and we will be gathering them and we'll get through as many as we can in the time that we have together today. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. Yes, so as I mentioned, this is the first of a series for our Cancel or Impact campaign, which will give a few announcements and next steps too at the end of this webinar. For the most part, all of our webinars will be hosted by our ED committee of the Cancel or Impact campaign. So if folks are looking to find out how to be of support or to get involved, we'll share more about that at the end of the webinar. In the meantime, the outline of our ED for today, our educational discussion, will be as follows. If you could go to the next slide. So today's program, first we're going to be talking about the 3 global fronts of US-led war, followed by an overview of the different military exercises around the globe and their impact on the people and the environment. And then we'll also be talking about the people's resistance against militarization, followed by our question and answer, and then announcements and next steps. So once again, for folks who are just coming into right now, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be gathering them and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time that we have allotted for today. So we have about an hour and a half together. And with that, I am going to pass it on to Derek to do some speaker introductions of our speakers for today.
Great, thanks so much, Misty. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see so many of you online today. My name is Derek. I'm with Resist US-Led War Seattle. And yeah, I'm just really happy and appreciative to be here. And yeah, I'll pass it over to the next speaker.
Hello, I'm Kevin, and I'm based on occupied Duwamish territory, otherwise known as Seattle. And yeah, thanks for being here. And I'll pass to, let's see, I think Shanika.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Shanika. I'm a member of Goldmine San Diego, based in National City. I'm also helping to lead the Council Impact Education Committee alongside Misty. Yeah, nice to see everyone here. I'll pass it on to Megan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Megan. I am zooming in from Manoa Valley on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. I'm involved with a few different student groups here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, but presenting in my capacity as an individual today. And I think I'll pass it to Adria.
Hi, y'all. My name is Adria. I'm one of the people on tech. I'm doing the slides. I'm based out of Stockton, California, which is occupied Yokuts land. Thank you. And I'll pass it back to Misty.
Yes. And then, so I'm Misty. I am a member of Anakai in Hawaii, also calling in from Honolulu, Hawaii, in the occupied kingdom of Hawaii. And I will pass it to one of our student committee members, Kira.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kira. I'm zooming in from Portland. We have our whole watch party back here. I'm with Half the Sky, PNW. Excited to be here.
Great. Okay. So thank you, everyone. And then with that, once again, just housekeeping reminders for those who are just entering the Zoom. We are recording this we'll be posting it eventually on our YouTube. So if you know folks who are interested in the topic but aren't able to make it today, please feel free to direct them, and sure they'll be able to send a mass email as well to folks about the Zoom, the link to the Zoom recording once it's up. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Folks will be gathering them, and we'll get through as many as we can by the end of the webinar. Okay, and I will pass it on to Derek to begin our educational discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Again, I'll be just broadly introducing the three global fronts of US-led war, a little bit about their associated military strategies, and hopefully this will inform and deepen our understanding of military exercises. You can go to the next slide, thank you. So these are considered the main sites of US-led aggression and military buildup. And we focus on these three in particular, not due to speculation or conjecture, but because in these regions we see the strongest military alliances, the highest deployment of US military personnel, and also the most important existential threats to the United States. And those are their words directly. We know that the US ruling class spends tremendous energy convincing us, the people, that these are targets that we must fear, and therefore we must support US military operations in these regions. So it's really important to challenge imperialist narratives about these war fronts, to expand our understanding of the fact that ultimately US policy is centered around these fronts to reap the economic benefits of regional territorial control. And so following that analysis, we also must remember that the United States is everywhere. There are US military operations literally all over the planet, but these three in particular hold significant implications. And so the first area that we see there is Eastern Europe, where the US has been facilitating eastward expansion of NATO to target and isolate Russia. The second front is in West Asia, where Iran is facing increasing hostilities from this developing alliance between the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, as well as some other Gulf states as well. And then lastly, and most importantly, we have the Indo Pacific, which you'll notice is highlighted here, and that's intentional because this is considered the primary front for the United States. And again, these are their words. This is laid out really clearly in the Biden-Harris National Security Strategy, which was released back in 2022, and directly identifies China as the most consequential geopolitical strategy. And in this region, we see the US operating through defense alliances such as Quad, which is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and that one is less active in particular, but also AUKUS, which is an alliance between Australia, the UK, and the United States. And then also in the last year or so, we've seen this rapid development of this new trilateral alliance between the United States, Japan, and South Korea, which coalesced into the release of this statement last fall called The Spirit of Camp David, in which they again identify the importance of these alliances because of increasing hostilities with China, the DPRK, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as well as Russia. And so we can talk about each of these fronts for hours and hours, but I have about 10 to 15 minutes. So let's just go ahead and dive right in, and we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So starting off with this first front, the US-NATO alliance against Russia. I want to start us off with a question, and you can just go ahead and send your responses in the chat box, or in the chat, excuse me. But that question is, what are some of the mainstream media narratives about US presence in this region? You might be able to gather some information from this slide, but I would really love to hear some of your responses and what you've heard about US military in this region. And I'll give about maybe 10, 15 seconds and just read a couple of them off. Yeah, so I'm seeing defend Ukraine against Putin and Russia. Putin is a maniac. Yeah, yeah, they're trying to defend democracy. It's beneficial to Ukraine's offense. Russia is responsible for gas price inflation. U.S. is helping defend Ukraine against Russian expansion. Yeah. Yeah, these are all very prominent narratives throughout the U.S. media, and you can kind of see that reflected in just these like small news clippings right here in The Guardian, which states defeat for Ukraine would be a global disaster. NATO must finally step in to stop Russia. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So now let's actually get into what the true interests are of the United States in this region. So firstly, Russia holds some of the world's largest oil reserves, and this positions them, or this puts them in a really good position to supply the entirety of Europe with oil. And as such, they become a top competitor to the United States, which also wants to supply Europe with oil. And it wasn't actually until, I believe actually until the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, that the US was able to finally replace Russia as Europe's top crude oil supplier. Also with the destruction of the Nord Stream natural gas pipeline, which the US has heavily denied involvement in, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. But additionally, we know that the war in Ukraine, a very large contributing factor to this was the eastward expansion of NATO territory dramatically since the end of the Cold War. And you can see in the diagram on the left here, a more updated list of NATO territory, including some which joined just in the last couple of years. Excuse me. So a lot of this work has been done through NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which holds countries far deep into mainland Europe, as well as some like partners in cooperations around the globe, actually. And it was founded post-World War II with this mission of keep America in, Russia out, and Germany down. So it's very clear what the US interests are in this region. And in fact, we can also recently see that Western financial institutions are seeking to allow for this buildup of private investment in these post-war reconstruction efforts in Ukraine. Can go ahead and move to the next slide. So I won't spend too much time on this slide just for time's sake, but just to give an idea of how many troops are stationed within the eastern territories of NATO. We can see that this is a very dramatic military buildup. There are even in U.S. naval fleets, 24-hour air patrol and surveillance. So there's ongoing escalation throughout this region. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay. All right. So moving into this next front here, this U.S., Israel, and Saudi alliance against Iran in West Asia. So I just want to kind of put forth the same question as the last time. What are some of the mainstream media narratives about the United States presence in this region? So again, you can just
Hey, Joe, come here.
send responses over in the chat, and I'll read a couple of them off. Yeah, so I'm seeing that Iran is a rogue state, that the United States presence is necessary for stability, definitely playing into the war on terror as well, defending Israel at all costs, certainly. We've seen escalation of the genocide in Palestine and the United States doubling down on its support ever since. Spreading democracy, saving so-called Israel from terrorists. You have to defend Israel no matter what. Protecting democracy and rights to freedom and expression in the Middle East, and Israel is helping with that mission. Ensuring access to shipping routes. Yeah, thank you. Those are all really great responses. And we can, again, we can kind of gather all this from this slide alone with this unhinged photo of Netanyahu presenting to the Security Council this existential threat of Iran. Let's see, we can actually move to the next slide, please. So again, investigating the actual interests of the United States in the region, lo and behold, a large factor of this is oil. Iran holds, I believe, the world's third largest oil reserves in the entire world. And there are also very critical and vital global trade shipping routes in this region as well. In general, commercial shipping routes as well. But we can again draw from the Biden-Harris national security strategy, which states Iran interferes in the internal affairs of neighbors, proliferates missiles and drones through proxies, is plotting to harm Americans, including former officials, and is advancing a nuclear program beyond any credible civilian need. So there's a lot of fear-mongering in that statement alone. And in line with that, Biden has been working with Israel and Saudi Arabia to build up this new alliance to deepen its defense capabilities in the region. And you can see in the diagram on the right side here, just the list of military bases that US troops have utilized. And if you notice, their location matches up quite well with major oil pipelines throughout the region in oil fields as well. So the connection there is really clear. And someone had brought up Israel before as well. We know that Israel has been intensifying their genocidal war over the last 7 months, and as tensions heighten, there is growing resistance throughout the region, which eventually led to Yemen beginning a siege against initially Israeli-linked shipping companies, but really anything that was passing through this region. And the US had launched an operation to protect commercial shipping. So it's quite clear that the United States is more concerned with international commerce in this region than peace, security, and as well as the lives of over 40,000 Palestinian people. And I think we can move to the next slide here. Okay, great. All right, so moving to this third front in the Indo Pacific, which consists of this US Quad sort of AUKUS, more so AUKUS alliance against China and the DPRK. So as I mentioned, this is the primary front for the United States. It has been, the United States has been moving a large amount of its military capacity and its troops over to this region over the years. So again, for just one last time, if we could answer this question, what are some of the mainstream media narratives about US presence in the region? They might be quite similar to ones we've heard before. Yeah, so I'm seeing Kim Jong-un is crazy, protecting a free and open Indo-Pacific, protecting against the DPRK. It's evil. We have to protect South Korea. We have to stop China, helping Taiwan achieve their independence. that they're defending the Philippines from China. Yeah, that North Korea has nuclear weapons and therefore we have to stop them. Yeah, so these are really, really common justifications for military buildup in the region. And you can see just from some of these clippings here, like we have really absurd think tank pieces, for example, pushing for the US and allies to beat China in this space race to assure this rules-based order. We have accusations against Kim Jong-un preparing for war, preparing to launch nuclear weapons, accusations that are totally out of line with the historical record. So can we move to the next slide, please? Oh, great, thank you. Okay, so yeah, again, what are some of the actual interests of the US in this region? Why is this the primary front for the United States? So what we have listed here, this is directly pulled from the mouths of the imperialists. This is not something that we were just able to find online. This is something they publish widely and make known. This region holds over half of the world's youth, aged 18 to 24. It holds 65% of the oceans, 25% of the land, has tremendous global economic growth, an overwhelming majority of global GDP. So the United States recognizes this region as a vital driver of the global economy. It holds international sea lanes. It holds a vast majority of the largest ports in the world as well. And as such, it's also a very heavily militarized region, which holds, I believe, I think 6 or 7 of the world's largest standing militaries, and also 5 of the world's declared nuclear nations. So altogether, the strategic importance for the United States is quite clear. And another factor that you might hear quite often in the media in relation to Taiwan is the production of these semiconductor chips. Taiwan is one of the leading chip producers in the entire world and holds something like over 50% of overall market share in this like global semiconductor market. And so Taiwan supplies a lot of its chips to a variety of multinational corporations, which include American corporations like Apple, for example, and is quite important for computer manufacturing, for weapons manufacturing, just other built-up industries. And so what's also laid out in the Biden-Harris national security strategy is this desire to take control over the Taiwan Strait. It's a very aggressive, direct proclamation of what their goal is in this region, to agitate for war. Can we go to the next slide, please? And just to touch on some of the military alliances and buildup in the region. So AUKUS is this security cooperation between Australia, the UK, and the United States, and consists of this like 2-pillar approach. Pillar 1 is this years-long effort to actually provide Australia with nuclear-capable submarines. And Pillar 2 is focused on developing cutting-edge technology, which includes, I believe, AI development and like hypersonic technology, for example. And actually just read this morning that South Korea is really pushing to become integrated within Pillar 2 of this AUKUS alliance. And Japan is also looking to get involved. Right above that is a photo of a recent meeting between Biden, the Philippine President Marcos, and the Japanese Prime Minister, which was held, I believe, just less than a month ago. We're seeing tremendous military buildup in the region, but in particular the Philippines. You'll notice in the Biden-Harris national security strategy that the Philippines is not really mentioned. And that's because it has long been used as a military outpost for these imperialist wars. And as it stands, the U.S. doesn't anticipate any challenge to this because of how much they're moving their military capacity over to this region. And this also underscores the importance of military alliances in the other two fronts, because the U.S. is focusing so much of its attention and so much of its military power into this region in particular. And so just to close off, to finish off quickly here with this island chain strategy, to really show this military buildup in the region. So this first island chain is this like first line response in which the U.S. has strategically positioned military bases along this as a first line of response in the event of an attack from China. Whereas the second island chain here serves more as building up their defense capabilities. And these military installations, we'll hear in a little bit, cause tremendous destruction to the livelihood of the island inhabitants, of the environment. And so just really want to drive home that this military buildup in these defense alliances go hand in hand with these destructive military exercises that I will actually now pass over to Kevin to give an overview of.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Zurich. Yeah, so we'll be starting going over just an overview of some, I'll stress some of the military exercises that take place across the globe. Of course, there are, hundreds and hundreds of these exercises that take place of various sizes throughout the year. So, we can't go over all of them, but we just wanted to highlight some of the larger ones and especially how they tie into what Zarek just told us about, the three global fronts of U.S. war at this particular time. And yeah, so next slide, please. We'll start with operations taking place in the European, area regarding the U.S.'s continuing strategy to antagonize Russia and fearmonger around them. So this first exercise is referred to as ball tops. Apparently that, is short for Baltic operations. And those take place in the Baltic Sea and surrounding regions, right at Russia's doorstep. These are led annually by U.S. naval forces since 1971. So going back quite far into the Cold War era. And, the operations like this are primarily a show force by the NATO countries, just to say we're here. And of course, the claim is always that the US and NATO are, maintaining quote unquote freedom of commerce and things like that in the waters just around Russia. Fear mongering as if Russia would somehow prevent that from happening. But really, it's mainly, these operations have mainly been about recruiting Eastern European countries, countries that border Russia and were former Soviet states or otherwise close in proximity to the former Soviet Union. And many of the countries now participating in U.S. NATO operations have, over the years come to join NATO after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, including countries like Estonia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, a lot of those areas to kind of surround Russia, really, be there right at their doorstep and then complain that Russia is somehow threatening that region when the U.S. is the one who wants those regions to have its foothold right there at all times. So next slide, please. All right, and so this particular exercise is called Steadfast Defender, and this one is couldn't find whether this one takes place necessarily every year, but in this particular year, they are the largest NATO military drills that are taking place since the Cold War era, since 1988, with 90,000 personnel taking place from North America, U.S., Canada, and NATO, other NATO allies, and a lot of those, Eastern European countries that we mentioned. And this exercise is actually still going on right now as we speak, and they began back in January, and so that's quite a long time for a military, exercise to take place over several months. And there has been a lot of talk that it is, due to the ongoing antagonism of the U.S., between the U.S. and Russia wanting to make their presence felt and to show that they're still ready, uh, to attack potentially Russia at any time with their footholds right at their doorstep. And so there are at least 50 warships, 80 aircraft, and 1,100 combat vehicles being used in these various exercises, tanks, military, armored personnel carriers, those types of things. And yeah, as we mentioned, showing their force in that region is very important to the U.S. and NATO strategy of maintaining, that front of their imperialist aims. So next slide, please. All right, so this one is African Lion. And these are the largest U.S. AFRICOM exercises held annually since 2002. AFRICOM is the U.S. African Command, which didn't officially go into place until the end of George W. Bush's presidency. It officially started in 2008. So I guess these particular drills predated the official, creation of AFRICOM. But as we'll see, AFRICOM has greatly expanded the U.S. military presence in Africa. These take place across Morocco, Ghana, Senegal, and Tunisia. And 10,000 personnel from 20 countries, as well as NATO, take part in ground, air, and maritime operations. And there are also many U.S. Special Forces deployed to this region to train and do other shady things that, we may never know about. If you recall, in 2017, there were 3 Green Berets that were killed in Niger, the country of Niger, or Niger, excuse me. And people were wondering, why our troops in Niger? Well, they're there, preparing for wars, all over the globe, especially in West Asia. There are also many drone bases that have been built throughout Africa due to its proximity to West Asia. And there are also drone strikes that take place within the continent of Africa as well, such as Somalia. And AFRICOM was greatly expanded during Barack Obama's administration. And there are also, CIA bases, but, we don't have time to get into the CIA today. And yeah, next slide, please. That brings us to Cutlass Express, whatever that means. This is another AFRICOM sponsored exercise led by the U.S. Naval Forces since 2010. So right there at the beginning of Obama's administration, as he greatly expanded the presence of the U.S. military in Africa. And these exercises are just part of that, as they are vital to U.S. neocolonialism and imperialism. And what that means in particular is the U.S. maintaining its hegemony, right? A lot of African nations were formerly colonies of various European countries, and although on paper they may be, quote unquote, independent now and have, their own flags and things like that, the power relations as well as the political and economic imbalances and relations remain in place. So not a lot in reality on a material level has changed between the colonial era and today, and that's what's referred to by neo-colonialism, and we'll hear more about that with regard to places like the Philippines as well. And another major reason for the U.S. Military presence in Africa is to suppress, popular uprising of the masses of people, right? If people in Africa rise up and elect people who represent them who don't want to be under the U.S. Imperialist thumb anymore, there goes all the rare earth minerals, and without rare earth minerals, you don't have all the fancy military equipment and other things that are used by the U.S. military or by corporations based out of the U.S. So they have a lot of interest in maintaining, the U.S.'s imposed order in Africa, and unfortunately, a lot of that includes, selling military equipment to the local police forces in various African countries, just like you know they do in the U.S. Itself to help them help their installed cooperative puppet governments to suppress the people there and keep them from rising up. So yeah, these exercises take place in the vicinity of Djibouti, Kenya, Madagascar, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. And there are 15 countries that participate from East Africa, West Indian Ocean, Europe, and North America. Yeah, this region is very close to the Red Sea, is right next to the Red Sea, and of course the U.S. wants to maintain that shipping lane for its corporate partners as well, as is going on now between Yemen and the U.S. really upset about Yemen's resistance on behalf of Palestine. So we'll go to the next slide. This is exercise Bright Star. They began in 1980 following agreements between Egypt and Israel, and they're led by the U.S. and Egypt currently. And unfortunately, yeah, Egypt has become very close to the United States, and they're very pivotal in the U.S. strategy in West Asia. And this exercise has grown to include up to 11 countries and 70,000 personnel, and is vital to the interventions because of its proximity and maintaining that relationship between leaders that are friendly to U.S. interests and punishing those who are not, as we saw what happened in Libya. Okay, next slide, please. So this exercise is Native Fury. They're biennial, taking place on the Arabian Peninsula. They consist of 4,000 U.S. military personnel along with Emirati forces, and really exemplifies the close relationship between the U.S. And the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is a major purchaser of U.S. military weaponry. Billions of dollars they've spent buying U.S. military weapons. And their drills apparently include seizing a so-called model Middle Eastern city complete with oil refineries and a mosque. And so you can only imagine what they're practicing for in such a drill if they, continue their intervention and occupation in West Asia, especially Iran, as has been mentioned. So next slide, please. And so we'll move to the Indo Pacific. The main exercises that we're discussing here, RIMPAC, meaning Rim of the Pacific, began in 1971, was annual until 1974, when it became biennial because of how large the exercises have become over the years. And there are 26 participating countries, led by the U.S., of course, and over 25,000 military personnel converge on occupied Hawaii. As you can see in the picture, just multiple aircraft carriers just converging on occupied Hawaii, as if the U.S. hasn't already done enough. To Hawaii, each aircraft carrier can hold anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 military personnel. So you can imagine the effect that has on the local people. Next slide, please. And we have next the Balikatan exercises, which is Tagalog for shoulder to shoulder. These are the largest U.S.-Philippines joint military exercises. Over 16,000 personnel from the U.S., Philippines, Australia, and France, with other countries observing. And they perform drills on the Batanes Island chain and other locations, which are very provocative towards China, of course. As you heard from Zarek, that's a very hot topic right now. And this year, they are performing exercises outside of Philippine territorial waters for the first time. And yeah, thanks for reminding me in the chat. They're still ongoing right now, I think until the end of the week or so. And yeah, with that, we'll go to the next slide. And this is just a map showing, why it's so provocative for the U.S. to be drilling, performing these military maneuvers in this region. As you can see, the Batanes Islands that are part of the Philippines are only 102 miles away from Taiwan. So yeah, I mean, we can see easily why there's that provocation being stirred up, and yeah, the ongoing power plays by the U.S. and China as well, trying to find places to put new military footholds and small bases around that region. So next slide, please. Next, we have Cobra Gold, hosted by the U.S. and Thailand, 7,000 personnel or more. Singapore, Japan, Malaysia, South Korea, and Indonesia are full participants with 23 countries observing. And this particular exercise incorporates amphibious landings, ground and air live fire, cyber warfare, and interoperability, which means really a lot of expensive equipment, new technology that the U.S. military wants to try out. Trying to maximize their dominance, incorporating cyber warfare, drone bases, and all of those things. And so with that, we'll go to the next slide. And here we have Pitch Black, which began as an Australian military training event, but Australia partnered with the US in 1983. It now includes 2,500 personnel with over 100 aircraft from 17 countries. And this is primarily air weapons training in Northern Australia. And yeah, today it's a projection of force in the Indo Pacific aimed squarely at China. During, at the height of, the US intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, they played, a slightly different role. But today, the US specifically uses this Northern Australian territory to place smaller bases, more remote bases that are more flexible and potentially harder to be targeted by China, by the Chinese military. So that's really important to their strategy in the Indo-Pacific today. And next slide, please. Yeah, this is our last exercise we'll be highlighting for today, COPE North, which takes place annually between the US, Australia, and Japanese air forces. And they conduct air combat and air-to-ground strike mission training. And these exercises are kind of launched out of Andersen Air Force Base in occupied Guam, also performing different drills in the vicinity of the Northern Mariana Islands, Palau, and Micronesia. And as we talked about in the last slide, the U.S. Air Forces or military in general, their current strategy of creating smaller bases that are harder to target for their so-called enemies, enemies from the U.S. perspective, of course. This particular exercise is also pivotal in that they have established many smaller bases on some of these smaller islands out in the Pacific. So yeah, with that, I will pass it on to Shanika. Thanks.
Hi, sorry, was having technical difficulties, but yeah, thank you, Kevin, for going through all those different military exercises. As he mentioned, those are really only the major ones. So it's not even a comprehensive list of all the military exercises that the US conducts all over the globe. And in the beginning, folks were sharing in the chat of what are the mainstream media narratives of the three fronts of US-led war, right? How all these wars that the US is waging, in Palestine, in against Russia, against China, are supposedly being done in the name of the people, right? And to protect the people of the US. But the reality is that these wars do not benefit, the broad masses of people, even here in the US. And not only do the wars not benefit us, but even the preparation for these wars, these different training exercises do not serve the people, but they actually destroy lives, they destroy livelihoods, especially for those where these training exercises are in the lands of those where these training exercises are held. So these exercises really come at the expense of the people. And yeah, so gonna go over a brief overview of the ways that these training exercises really impact the masses. It's not at all a comprehensive list, especially because these are things that are either not really reported, not really talked about, or even actively covered up by the U.S. military, by the U.S. government. So please feel free to share in the chat other things that too, because these impacts, it's only because of the people that we know these things, and our movement is only as strong as our links to the people on the ground. So yeah, feel free to share in the chat. But yeah, if you can go to the next slide, please. So the first impact that we wanted to talk about is, as Kevin was sharing, how these military exercises bring thousands and thousands of military personnel to foreign lands. And, if you're familiar with the culture of the US military, you know that sexual violence, especially against women or people who are perceived to be women, is rampant within the US military. So these training exercises also come with increased gender-based violence committed by these military personnel against the local people there, especially women and even young girls. And these are crimes that are committed that these military personnel are not held accountable. They're shielded by the U.S. government, even though you know, these crimes happen on foreign lands even, but they are ultimately pardoned by the U.S. government. One very notable case is the murder of Jennifer Laude, who was a 26-year-old Filipina trans woman who was murdered by U.S. Marine Joseph Scott Pemberton in 2014 in Subic Bay, because he was there for routine military exercises. When he found out that she was a trans woman, he killed her in cold blood. And he was originally tried in a Philippine court, but ultimately was extradited by the US. He was sent back here. He was never held accountable for his egregious crime, and now he's just free here in the US. After he was pardoned by Philippine President Duterte. Another case too is in 2016. Island is a military base. 3/4 of it is a U.S. military base. He killed a 20-year-old woman. He sexually assaulted her and killed her, and she was missing for 3 weeks, and her body was found in a forest. She was just dumped in a forest, and he too was never held accountable. And yeah, you can see here on the slide too. This is the Club Hot Ash. That's like an advertisement in Hawaii, welcoming RIMPAC, you know, a gentleman's quote unquote club. So these, you know, it's just a well-known thing that these training exercises bring, you know, increased sexual exploitation against women. But then, you know, of course, right, with the violence, with the exploitation, with the oppression that women face at the hands of these military training exercises, we also know that women play a critical part of the anti-war, anti-militarism movement, and you know, have played and continue to play a huge role in opposing war and violence. So just also really want to highlight that too, that you know, wherever there is exploitation, wherever there is oppression, there is also the people's resistance. So yeah, can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, the other biggest thing, right? Right now we are in an era of climate change, right? Which the number one perpetrator, the number one cause of climate change is U.S. imperialism, and the U.S. military cannot be disconnected from that. We're actually the Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Defense, is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the entire world. And so the US military is a key contributor to climate change. Actually, research has shown that if the US military alone was considered as a nation, they would be the 47th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. And yeah, like, you know, Kevin was like, went through like some numbers of like all the different jets and vehicles and ships that are brought along in these military exercises. And, you know, these vehicles use an insane amount of fossil fuels that not only, you know, like in their consumption pollute the air, but they also often seep into the groundwater of these different places that the training exercises take place. And, you know, and in these training exercises too, the US military often leaves behind landmines. You know, they leave behind toxic chemicals that have long-lasting detrimental health effects to the people who live there. One example is Vieques, Puerto Rico, which used to be a US military base, but the people successfully kicked them out in 2003, where it's a very small island, but the US Navy controlled 70% of it. But you know, the people successfully kicked them out, but unfortunately, because you know, they really use this place for training exercises too. There's so much hazardous waste there. There's bombs that litter the island. That the sign on the slide is actually a sign that's in a wildlife reserve. This wildlife reserve that is just littered with bombs. Where many of the people there die due to cancer, due to lung disease, and the the presence of the military base has long-lasting effects where they still lack basic infrastructure. There is no hospital on that island, and yet the people there face a larger risk of cancer than other places in Puerto Rico. So yeah, so there's the overall global effects of climate change that the US military is causing, but then there's also like, yeah, these training exercises that leave behind just a wake of devastation even after the exercises are finished. And to the right, the image is talking about the case of Tubataha Reef in the Philippines when the USS Guardian destroyed part of the reef. It's a coral reef in the Philippines. And yeah, yeah, not only, of course, like these have effects to the environment, but because it's destroying the lands, it also affects the people's livelihood. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the cost to livelihood is very great, like as I was sharing, the destruction of coral reefs, these military exercises, destroy fisheries, they contaminate fertile soil, which really affect the livelihood, especially in places like the Philippines, of fisher folk, of peasant farmers. For example, in the Philippines, the US military in Ilocos Norte, because of the Balikatan exercises, and they built a seawall to fortify their base, which really hinders the seafaring and docking of fishermen there. And this is an area that is supposed to, like, it's not one of the agreed upon locations to have US military facilities. And, during the Balikatan exercises, when they have live fire exercises, small fisher folk are not able to fish. And these exercises can go from, 7 days, or, this year it's from April 22 to May 8th. And so that's like how many days where people can't earn the precarious livelihood that's already precarious. And yeah, you can see in the graphic too, there's this narrative that the US military helps create jobs, but if you look at the bar graph, what it's showing there is that on the very left side, the blue for federal defense is showing like how many jobs were created from $260 billion. And then on the rest is showing how many jobs like these other industries would have created if the same amount of money was invested into those industries. And you can see that the defense industry creates much less jobs than all these other industries. So it's really an outright lie to say that the military is creating more opportunities for people like here in the US That's just an outright lie. But not only is it not creating opportunities for the people here, but it is robbing people of livelihood for on foreign lands where these training exercises happen. So next slide, please. Yeah, so not the Balikatan exercises last year, um, um, he was sharing how they were made to participate in the exercises, not being part of the Philippine military even, but just because these exercises were happening, you know, where they live, they were forced to, so like soldiers that yeah, like in the exercises, like pretended to die or pretended to be wounded. They had to carry the soldiers, and he was reflecting like that means during a real war, this is what we're gonna have to do. And he was like, damn, they were heavy. You know, so it's also like preparing people for when slide please. And again, in that location, in Ilocos Norte, it's not even an agreed upon location for US military to be operating. Next slide, please. Uh-oh. Okay, yeah, thank you. So yeah, and lastly, of course, because these training exercises include using lethal weapons, people have died because of these training exercises. Again, this is not at all even a comprehensive list. This is just from 2 different nations, the Philippines. Um, um, like, yeah, a 1-year-old infant was killed in 2009 by a grenade in her own home, her family's home. And 5 more of her relatives were also wounded and with the explosion of the grenade because the armed forces of the Philippines were clearing the area for the Balikatan exercises. There's also been 2 indigenous teenagers that were killed by a grenade that was left behind by US military troops from the Balikatan exercises. And again, these US troops were not held accountable. They were whisked away to the US. And yeah, Arsid Baharun also was shot by an American soldier while he was in his own farm because the US soldiers were using his farm as a firing range. Bisma Juhan shrapnel from a live fire exercise. Um, and David Sanes Rodriguez was killed in Vieques, Puerto Rico, back when it was an active US military base. While he was a security guard, he was on his shift at his security post, and he was killed by a 2,000 pound bomb that during a training exercise. And yeah, so these are all like tragedies, like people that we've lost because of these training exercises, not even you know the wars themselves, but just the training exercises. Yeah, so next slide, please. Yeah, if you can go to the next slide. the as Kevin, oh no, freaking, oh, sorry, technical difficulties. But yeah, as Kevin was saying, these military exercises are vital to U.S. imperialism in subjugating their colonies, their neo-colonies, you know, because yeah, U.S. imperialism really depends on the exploitation and oppression of our peoples, and yeah, the subjugation of the colonies and neo-colonies. So these constructions of U.S. military bases and use of foreign and indigenous lands is a direct violation of, you know, the people's right to self-determination. We should have the right to say if U.S. military bases are on our lands, if training exercises are conducted with where people live, which, you know, not only applies to foreign places, but also like here in San Diego, here in the US, and Hawaii too. And so, you know, are these training exercises really in accordance with the interests and wishes of the people? No. So these training exercises are really a violation of the sovereignty and self-determination of oppressed peoples and nations. But, you know, with that violation, we know that the people rise up, right, to fight back against this attack against the people. So I'll pass it off to Megan to talk about the people's resistance.
Great, thank you so much, Shanika. Yes, so I'm gonna spend just very few minutes, unfortunately, talking about resistance to militarization. This is definitely not a comprehensive even overview, but just a few examples of how everywhere there's a military base, everywhere there is military exercises happening, there's some form of resistance, and it's led not by people who are in power, but by grassroots individuals and organizations. So I'll share a few examples focusing really on the so-called Indo Pacific region. And we're focusing on this region specifically given the intensity of the military buildup there recently, of course, as Zarek pointed out to us, but also episodically dating back as far back as the late 19th century, peaking during really intense geopolitical times like World War II, the Cold War, and of course today. So these are, again, just a few examples, very superficial surface level overviews. But if there are folks on this call now who have been involved in any of these movements or who are involved in movements in their own homes, please definitely share more information in the chat. You can go to the next slide. So the first examples are coming from Okinawa, where the United States military has 31 exclusive use facilities. That's about 70% of all US military bases in Japan, with about 25,000 service people stationed in Okinawa. So alongside this heavy military presence, there has been military violence. Many of the impacts that Shanika just told us about, a notorious military helicopter crash in 1994, the abduction and gang rape of a 12-year-old girl by American servicemen in 1995, as well as like massive environmental degradations as well. But again, anywhere there's a military base, there is resistance, and Okinawans have been at the forefront leading this for decades. These impacts of militarization fueled Okinawan social movements and political pressure that eventually prompted Japan and the US to agree to close Futenma Marine Corps Air Station in the 1990s. Although, of course, as we know too, empires don't fall in a day. So the US decided to shift its marine focus or its marine forces from Okinawa to Guam, many people might know it as Guam, and to a new base being built in a more rural part of Okinawa called Henoko. So I'll talk about some of the resistance in Guam shortly. But in Henoko, there have been a lot of actions to delay the construction of this new military base. The base still isn't complete nearly 30 years after this agreement was reached between the US and Japan. So that means for nearly 30 years, Okinawans have been saying no to this base being built. They've voted in anti-base politicians. They've demonstrated, there have been blockades. So for example, they've prevented vehicles from entering or exiting the base. At sea, kayakers have paddled out into military restricted areas to block construction materials from entering the bases. They've even used scuba gear to lock themselves onto equipment and prevent this construction from happening. So again, people have been making it as difficult as possible to let the United States, to let Japan continue militarizing in Okinawa and to stop them from building this base in what is a very, very precious place. You can go to the next slide. The next example is from Puerto Rico on the island of Vieques, which Shanika has introduced to us already. So the US military presence here dates back to 1941, when World War II, the US hasn't formally entered World War II, but the conflict is certainly well underway. And US troops essentially turned the island of Vieques into what became a de facto war zone. Naval troops evict 10,000 people living on the island at gunpoint and relocate them to a tiny strip of land between what the Navy turned into a bombing range on one side and an ammunition storage facility on the other. On the rest of the island that the Navy is occupying at this point, the devastation it's extraordinary. There's ship-to-shore gunfire training, there's air-to-ground bombing, there's marine amphibious landing for decades, meaning there's destruction coming from literally all angles. And the environmental impacts, like Shanika pointed out, are profound. There's napalm, there's uranium, there's lead and other toxic chemicals. And all of these trainings were in preparation for what are now widely accepted as failed wars waged by US imperialism in Vietnam and Korea and Panama and Iraq. But again, as Shanika pointed out, and as we know, anywhere there's a base, there's resistance. So for decades, people on Vieques protested the US military presence, which culminated upon the death of David Sanes Rodriguez when he was killed by military ordnance. And what I want to point out, what I really want to emphasize about this movement to shut down Vieques is that it came from people of all different backgrounds. It came from church groups, it came from health advocates, it came from women's groups, even typically very pro-US political groups, all came together to get the Navy out of Vieques. It wasn't just like radical students or environmentalists, but people with all sorts of political ideologies who recognized that this base was harmful and that it didn't have a right to exist in Vieques. Next slide, please. So RIMPAC, of course, is scheduled to be held in Hawaii this summer, but there's a very long, very robust history of resisting the military here in Hawaii, and one of those comes from the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana. So as, again, just a tiny bit of background, in 1941, the United States Army signed a sublease with Kaho'olawe Ranch Company, allowing them to acquire bombing rights of the island for $1 a year. And December of the same year, 1941, the Navy decided to sequester the entire island and started using it as a live ordnance training area, similar to what we've seen in Vieques and Guahan and elsewhere across the world. They conducted bomb tests for years there without any real insight until the 1970s, when a group of Hawaiians formed the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana, or PKO. Members of PKO start occupying the island as resistance to the live fire training. They file a federal lawsuit charging the Navy with violating laws to the environment, to historic preservation, to religious freedom, because Hawaiians had been effectively banned from visiting this island, had watched what ended up being millions of pounds of bombs dropping onto places that are sacred, that have immense cultural and spiritual significance. So in 1992, PKO holds a healing ceremony on Kaho'olawe intended to hasten the return of the island to the people of Hawaii. And then in 1993, Congress finally votes to end the military use of the island. They also authorize, I think, $400 million to clear the island of ordnance. And the state of Hawaii then designates Kaho'olawe as a natural and cultural reserve to be used by Native Hawaiians. So today the military is out of Kaho'olawe. This is another successful movement to kick the military out. Of course, there's still ordnance there. So it's been decades now of cleaning that up, and it will probably take decades to get, all of the ordnance out. But the military is no longer using this for current testing. You can go to the next slide. So the Philippines. Of course, the US had claimed the Philippines as a US territory since 1898. And then after World War II, when the US gives the Philippines its so-called independence, the US and the Philippines governments sign a military bases agreement that essentially gives the US the right to operate bases in the Philippines for 99 years. This later gets shortened to 25 years. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, when these base agreements are being renegotiated, mass movements in the Philippines successfully pressure the US and Filipino governments to alter the agreement. They also stipulate that the United States must pay $500 million in compensation for the bases. So there's now compensation, but of course, the US still has access to those bases at this point in time. The agreement is set to expire in 1991, and again, a very strong anti-base movement ends up influencing the negotiations, eventually getting the Senate to reject an extension of the agreement and ends up giving the US 1 year to withdraw their bases from the Philippines. So again, this is an example of people mobilizing together to kick the US military out, to reject the claim that militarization makes anybody or anywhere safer. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, I guess just to conclude this portion, the US military has refused to stop influencing the Philippines, as we should all know. There are contracts like the Visiting Forces Agreement. There are exercises like Balikatan that Kevin talked about. And just last year, the US and the Philippines announced that a 2014 agreement called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement will allow the US to use 4 more bases in the Philippines for its own military purposes. So the fight to get the US military permanently out is ongoing. Next slide, please. Yeah, and as I'm seeing, yeah, in the chat, they've never fully left. So these fights have to continue. Okay, so onto Guahan. Like I mentioned earlier, that agreement between Japan and the US to close Futenma in Okinawa prompted the US military not to just get rid of their military forces, but to relocate them. So they're currently in the process of relocating about 5,000 troops to Guahan, which is an unincorporated, occupied US territory. The site for this movement, this relocation, is Camp Blatz, a 4,000-acre installation that joins an already enormous military presence in Guahan at Andersen Air Base, which I think folks have also talked about during this presentation. This new Camp Blatz soft opened in 2020, had a harder opening last year, and it's prompted lots of resistance from groups like Putahi Liteksin, Save Ritidian, which is mobilizing against the destruction of sacred lands and seas. So there have been protests, there have been lawsuits, and we can expect these to all continue too until the military stops desecrating the island of Guahan. Next slide. And then finally, I just want to, soft opening of a US military base, wild. Sorry. I'm getting distracted by the chat. Finally, I just want to mention a few other ongoing resistance movements here in Hawaii as we prepare to shut down RIMPAC this year. There's Stop Bombing Pohakuloa, which is another sacred place on Hawaii Island that is trying to end live fire training. I was just watching a video from Al Jazeera Plus about what's going on there, so I'll drop that link in the chat shortly because it's pretty informative. There's also the Shutdown Red Hill movement that emerged in response to the Navy's leaking jet fuel into a major aquifer here on Oahu. Again, this is a movement that has been spearheaded by Native Hawaiians. There's also Malama Makua, an organization committed to bringing the sacred Makua Valley back under Hawaiian authority for culturally appropriate use. So this is another place that the US Army has leased for nothing since World War II. And actually, Hawaiians successfully got live fire training to stop in the early 2000s. So hoping that this lease can be fully ended in 2029. And I guess I just want to conclude with the point that there are so many other places and groups that are mobilizing against the US military all over the world, because again, anywhere there's a base, there is violence, and anywhere there is a base, there is resistance. So it might not be organized, it might not be mass mobilized, it might not be loud, but it's there. And with something like 800 US military bases outside of the United States, that's 800 something places where people are dealing with the military's bull hockey. There are organized movements happening in Okinawa, in the Philippines, in Guahan, in the Northern Mariana Islands, in South Korea, and the Marshall Islands, just to name a few. They're all over the place. And all of these, again, are driven by the very real fact that the US military isn't genuinely interested in anybody's safety or security, except for a very small group of people with very fat paychecks. So just want to emphasize that resistance to militarism is coming from the grassroots level. It's coming from the people who are impacted by military violence, who have to deal with the gendered violence, the environmental devastation, the displacement from their homes. It's not coming from the people in power. So as we're moving forward with this initiative to cancel RIMPAC, I just want to urge everybody here to channel all of this energy and momentum and the commitment that we have collectively into continuing to build out these organizations, these networks of solidarity and action with one another, and to follow the lead of the grassroots organizations who have been steering these movements on the ground for decades, right? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are platforms for this already. And so with that, I will pass it back to Misty to spearhead Q&A.
Thank you so much, Megan, and to all of our wonderful presenters. Y'all are amazing. And I do want to open it up to a few questions. We don't have a lot of time, but we do have some. I will say that throughout the webinar, there weren't any questions presented in the chat. So if folks wanted to put them in now, please feel free to do so. If not, we will move to our announcements and next steps. Okay, yeah. So if anything, if folks do have questions for afterwards, please feel free to message those who are organizing in your specific areas. If you don't know any, then we can maybe direct it towards, we'll find out a way to get your questions. If anything, we will have future webinars where folks can participate in as well. In that case, I will pass it off to Kiera to give some of our calls and for our final announcements and next steps. Thank you again for everyone for being here, and there you go.
Hey y'all from the PDX watch party. So we wanted to tie all of that great informative information back to our campaign. These are the calls that were launched at our national launch last month. So we're gonna cancel RIMPAC, ban Israel, no cooperation with genocide, US out of the Asia Pacific, US out of the Philippines, resist imperialist wars, shut down CANSEC, end the arms trade, no support for reactionary regimes, and no to NATO. Those are the 7 calls from the campaign. And you can go to the next slide. So if you may have heard, we are converging in San Diego as part of a national gathering against RIMPAC. When all of the ships gather in San Diego as part of the US sort of fleet before they go down to Hawaii. And so we are going to converge on June 29th through 30th. Save the date, we'll have a People Summit and mobilization against RIMPAC. The other updates from the campaign is that you can follow us on Instagram at Cancel RIMPAC Campaign. And then if you would like to get involved, you can be a sponsor or supporter. You can sign on at tinyurl.com/cancelrimpacsupport. We're really hoping to mobilize a lot of folks to San Diego to show up and show the US empire how many people are really fighting back. So seeing some comments, see you in San Diego. I don't know if there were any other questions that need to be answered, but thank you to all of the presenters. Thanks to the 100-something folks that came out to attend the webinar today. And if you have any other questions, feel free to add them to the chat, or you can message us on Instagram or anything like that.
Thank you so much, Kiera. I just wanted to share something that folks are saying in the chat for San Diego on Monday, May 20. Activist San Diego will center a monthly meeting on the topic, and Joy Enomoto from Hawaii Peace and Justice will be there. So that's something to look forward to for those who are in San Diego. Or if that's on Zoom, then if folks were looking to go into Zoom. But yes, again, thank you to all of our presenters, and we will see you at the next webinar. So follow Instagram. We'll see you then. Thank you. Mahalo nui.
Thank you.